In Chapter 16, we take a break from showing you the components, the syntax of the C language. Instead, we start to examine some of the standard C function library. I want to show you several of the very handy functions that are available in the standard C function library so that you can start producing really useful programs that actually do something meaningful. For example, we as yet have not had the ability to read data from a file or write data out to a file. That's a pretty important thing to be able to do in any C program. So in this chapter we learn how to do that amongst a few other things. In fact, we actually start by just doing a bit of a recap on some of the elements of the C language. In particular, I need to have a look again at main. Let's look at that first. The main function can take parameters like any other function. It can't just take any old parameters. There are actually two specific parameters that it can take if we choose to want to use those parameters. If we don't choose to use those parameters, as we have in the past not chosen to, then we can just leave the main function as taking no parameters at all. But if we want to, we can use those parameters. Main also has a return value. Main can return a value. It is an integer function. Well, what could that possibly mean? Where could main possibly return its value to? Well, the parameters that main takes and the return value that it gives are passed to and from the operating system or the shell or the command line. Call it what you will. What that means is when you're starting your program, you can actually specify parameters to the program on the command line of the program. And when the program finishes, you can look at the return value of the program, if you know how to do that, and determine, well, hopefully some piece of information from that. I'll show you what I'm talking about. The correct prototype for main is as follows. Main takes two parameters. One is an integer, and the second one is an array of strings. They're typically called argc and argv. You don't have to call them that, but most people do, so you might as well just for convention's sake. And function main returns an integer. Argc is the number of command line arguments of the program. In other words, it's the number of strings specified when the user typed in the name of the program or double-clicked on the icon or whatever it was they did to get the program going. How many parameters there were on the command line. Now, if you're used to using Windows and all you've ever done in the past is double-click on icons to start programs, you may not be aware of command line arguments or command line parameters. But if you've ever used DOS or certainly Unix, then anything that you type after the name of the program is considered to be a parameter to that program. For example, there's a DOS program called edit. And if at the DOS prompt, if at the C prompt you just typed edit config.sys, then argc would be set to 2. And argv would be an array of strings. There'd be two strings. The first would be edit, and the second would be config.sys. So the summary there, argv is an array of that many strings. Argc will be 2, and that will mean there are 2 strings in the array. Also, the return value of main, which is an integer, is sometimes used by the operating system or by other programs to determine whether the program concluded successfully or not. You may not know how to do that. If you're using DOS, then that corresponds to something called error level, if you've ever heard of that, if you've ever used a DOS batch file and have used error level, or if you're using Unix, you might like to examine after a program completes the value in the shell variable $?. If you don't know what either of those things mean, don't worry. You'll probably never use the return value of main, but you can use it if you want to. And you use it with the following convention. A return value of 0 is usually taken to signify that the program completed successfully, there were no problems. If there's any other return values, typically 1 or 2 or 3 or something like that, it usually means there was some kind of error. And it's up to the program to determine what value you pass back depending on what error. Like, for example, maybe the program needed to have on the command line a file name, and maybe that file name wasn't specified. That might generate a return value of 1. And if the file couldn't be opened, that might generate a return value of 2, and so on. But it's completely up to the programmer to determine what return values are returned from main. Anyway, all future exercises that we use to when we create main programs, we're going to use return values, and we may some of them use argc and argv as well.